amidst the US claim that India's oil purchases, they were fueling resources for Russia's war against Ukraine. India has consistently maintained its position and has been aimed at energy security. It is aimed at global stability. And it has also pointed out, and India has pointed out, the lack of reason in the argument that India was fueling Russia's war machine. In fact, India's ambassador to the United States, Vinay Mohan Kwatra, he said that he had shared the Indian perspective with Senator Lindsey Graham, who had urged Prime Minister Modi to emphasize on President Putin to end the war in Ukraine. And the meeting is important as it could be a step towards a possible thaw in the Indo-US ties, especially the trade ties, which have been hit by tariffs after President Trump's criticism over India buying oil. Meanwhile, I'm currently joined by Mr. Arun Kumar Singh, the former ambassador to the United States. Mr. Singh, thank you very much for speaking to us. Washington, it has once again flagged India's Russian oil purchases as what they call fueling the war machine. But India says it's about energy security, it is about global stability. How do you see this clash of narratives, sir?
So at the moment, I think the US wants to generate extra pressure on Russia because, President Trump had said that within 24 hours, he's going to resolve that conflict and that he'll have some conversations with President Putin and there'll be a ceasefire and things will start working on. So now they've realized that the approach they had hasn't worked and hasn't failed because they have to address some of the objective concerns that Russia has. And so they're nowhere near reaching there because there's also a difference of opinion between US, Europe and Ukraine on how to handle this issue. So when they've seen the failure of that policy, the normal US approach is to blame somebody else. So they're looking for somebody else to blame. And therefore, at the moment, either they could have done more sanctions on Russia. They don't want to do that because they want to have some dialogue with Russia. They could have done sanctions on China or raised tariff on China. They don't want to do that because China has displayed countervailing power by controlling the supply of rare earths, magnets, critical materials, which the US needs. And the US is in discussion with China to ease up on some of the export controls. So they felt that, okay, so at this stage, let's direct the pressure on Russia through India and therefore impose the tariffs of India. Now, when they do something which is obviously not justified, if you look at the figures, because as the Ministry of External Affairs spokesman pointed out, Europe is buying more from Russia than India is buying. US itself is buying uranium from Russia. So when this happens, they start creating a narrative. Some narrative can sell. So now this is the narrative that India is fueling the Russian war machine. And there is no basis to that. But that's the narrative they construct to try and justify what they're doing for other reasons. So that's what they've come up with. But as you pointed out, I think the challenge here is that through this process, they are having a negative impact on perceptions in India related to the US relationship. Historically, there is a memory in India of US being a coercive and unreliable partner. Now, for the last 25 years, US has tried to come out of that image and has been supportive of India in different contexts. But with the kind of approach they have adopted now, in India, it has resurrected the feeling that US is a coercive partner and unreliable partner. So I would say that the US is not really levying penalties or tariffs on India. It is levying tariffs and penalties on the US-India relationship. And there'll be consequences also for the US. So that's the situation we are dealing with. But they are approaching it in a short-term way, looking at addressing their own immediate needs, concerns, and President Trump's politics. We know where he wants to show that he's resolving conflicts all over the world. Now, he brought in the presidents of Armenia, Azerbaijan. He's going to meet President Putin next week in Alaska, and that, he should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So there is a Trump politics playing out. And all these are consequences of that.
A very important point that you have pointed out is that the US and the European Union, they continue trading with Russia. And this is something that India has also mentioned, yet they don't face any such moral scrutiny. Do you think this double standard is being acknowledged in some manner privately in Washington, even if it is not being admitted publicly?
I'm sure they're aware aware of it. They know all the
Okay.
facts. In fact, if you recall, President Trump was asked that question at a press conference that India says US is buying uranium, and he had no answer. So he said, I'm not aware of it. I'll get back to you. So they're aware of it. But it's just a question of, trying to use your power to put the blame on somebody else and try and take away attention from what you're doing yourself. And then you can make the argument that if you're so concerned about norms in international relations, how is it that you're reaching out in a major way to a country that everybody knows has been a supporter of terrorism, which is Pakistan?
Yeah.
And in the context of Afghanistan, the US itself earlier had repeatedly blamed Pakistan for providing support to Taliban that was killing US soldiers. And that relationship went up and down. So in the context of Pakistan, despite support of terrorism from Pakistan, because they want to deal with Pakistan for their own reasons, they don't pay attention to that aspect. So, in international relations, it's norms, principles are used to justify what you want to do otherwise.
Senator Graham also said that India has influence over Vladimir Putin and that India should use that influence wisely. Based on your assessment, Ambassador, how much influence does India realistically have especially in Moscow's strategic decisions?
Look, ultimately, each country takes decisions based on its assessment of its own interests. Russia takes decision based on its assessments of its own interests. We can convey to them our experience, our perspective, what we are hearing from others, but they'll make their own assessment. Similarly, India, when it takes decisions, if you, for example, Operation Sindoor, we took our own decision based on our own assessment of interest, not because A, B, or C said something or the other. So each country decides based on that. Of course, you talk to others, you hear from them. So, it's just an argument that Senator Graham might want to make, that India has influence because they want to blame India if Russia is not responding the way the US wants. But India certainly, you saw President Putin called the Indian Prime Minister, spoke to him about his conversation with the US Representative Steve Witkoff, telling him about his visit to Alaska. So conversations go on because you want to share perspectives. But I don't think President Putin is going to be influenced or condition his decision based on what anybody else is saying to him.
Okay, one final question from you, Ambassador Singh. If at all, the talks between Putin and Donald Trump, if it doesn't work out the way both the parties want it to, how do you think it would affect India, and especially United States' stand as far as India is concerned?
So I would say this. First, of course, we would hope that something positive emerges. But, it's going to be very difficult because the US has not really taken the Europeans and Ukrainians on board. They are not present at the meeting. And so if they feel their interests are not protected, they would oppose whatever comes out of that. And in the past also, you remember President Trump, even in his first term, had met President Putin. And not much came out of that. He met on several occasions with the North Korean leader. And eventually that series of talks also didn't work out. So it may work, it may not work, but that doesn't matter. I think eventually India will take its own decisions based on what is the value of the India-US relationship and what is the value of the India-Russia relationship. And we are not going to condition our decision related to Russia based on what the US is saying. Because ultimately you have to make your own assessment. And in India, I'm sure there is a memory of Russia having been a very reliable partner of India in the past. At moments of crisis, a very important defense supply partner. At the moment, very important energy partner. Now, US is also an important. And certainly we want to build more. It's our largest trading partner, largest investment partner, largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. Certainly we'd like to do more with the US, a very important technology partner. But that doesn't mean that we base our decisions based on what the US says, because their politics changes. If you saw in the Biden administration, for example, the Secretary of State said that we understand India's compulsions related to Russia. India's relationship with Russia developed at the time when the US was not willing to be that kind of a partner. Or the National Security Advisor said with India, we are playing the long game. So that was a different approach. Right now, it is the politics of President Trump that is impacting on the decision making. And we have to deal with that, keeping in mind very much our own interests, our autonomy of decision makings. And I think ultimately people realize that India is strong enough to take its own decisions. So that's very important for us to sustain that image.
All right. Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh, thank you very much for speaking with NDTV, and it's always a pleasure to have you on NDTV, sir.